Okay. Okay. Thank you very much to the organizer for including our paper. So this is shown to work with my colleague Diana Moreira at UC Davis, and this is called the benefit from meritocracy. So let me start with the broader motivation, which is that screening applicants based on how well they do in a competitive exam is common in a variety of contexts. So including the educational system, including the selection of workers in the public and in the private sectors. And in principle, we think that exams could be an effective way of selecting qualified individuals. However, there are concerns that exams might have a disproportionately negative impact on the chances of applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. And indeed, echoing these concerns, there's been kind of a pushback against, there's some weird noise. There's been a pushback against the use of exams in a variety. Further away, okay. So there's been a pushback against the use of exams in a variety of selection processes, going from standardized testing in the context of college admissions to something closer to our setting, which is the selection of public officials. At the same time, however, exams might replace other criteria in which applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds are potentially at an even worse disadvantage. So, for example, using exams might make personal connections less relevant, might also reduce the scope for subjective assessments and hence potentially reduce bias. So ultimately, it's really an empirical question whether selecting people based on how well they do in an exam is going to hurt or help the chances of applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. What we're going to do in this paper is to try to shed some empirical evidence on this question by investigating really major reform in American history, which is the introduction of competitive exams for the selection of some public officials, which happened in 1883 through the enactment of the Pendleton Act. So prior to the enactment of this law, jobs were allocated in a discretionary fashion and often based on personal and political connections. After the reform, some positions had to go to the people that scored the highest in an open and competitive exam. What we ask in this paper is how did this reform change the social composition of the federal bureaucracy, in particular, which groups in society gained and which groups in society lost representation. And to do that, what we've done is that we have put together a new data set in which we have digitized personal records of the US federal government, which we then link to US population censuses. And this allows us to observe the family background of government officials before and after the passing of the reform in relationship to characteristics such as parental wealth, parental occupations, race, etc. For identification, we are going to exploit the fact that the reform did not apply to every position in the federal administration. Rather, there was a set of exempted positions. So basically, what we're going to be doing is comparing the social background of people who are selected in exempted and non-exempted positions before and after the passing of the reform in a differences and differences setup. Our main finding is that actually the reform reduced the representation of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I'm going to walk you through how we get there. I want to be, given the limited time, I want to be brief with the historical background, but let me tell you like the key ingredients of the Pendleton Act. So really the main provision of the Act is that employees in certain classified positions had to be selected through open and competitive exams. The content of the exam was based on basically the common school curricula, meaning reading, writing, and arithmetic had a very important weight. And the reform initially applied to the following set of positions. So if we look at people that were employed in the executive departments in Washington, D.C., this applied to people who were in technical or clerical positions with salaries of no less than $900 and no more than $1,800 per year. The main covered position were government clerks. They account for about 80% of the treated positions. Who is exempted? So there were kind of two sets of exceptions. So people that have kind of very entry-level positions who were employed merely as laborers or workmen, they were exempted from exams. But also the exams excluded people who were at the very top of the state hierarchy, anyone who required confirmation by the Senate, all elected officials, etc. So to summarize, basically what the reform did was to impose exams on the middle of the state hierarchy while accepting the bottom and the top. To answer this question, what we did was to collect this new data in which we have digitized personal records of the U.S. federal government. So this is one example page of this official register of the United States. So we digitized this for a period of 20 years. So we have data spanning 1871 to 1893. And let me walk you through the information that we have. So in the first column, we have the names of people. In the second, we know where these people were born. In the third one, we know where they were living prior to being appointed. And then we also know that all of them work in Washington, D.C., and we also know their compensation. And we also know what they did. So what we did is that after digitizing all of this data, we look for these people in earlier population censuses, and this allows us to observe the family background of these people, including characteristics such as parental occupation, but also their own occupations prior to joining the bureaucracy, which also allows us to say something about whether these attracted people with kind of stronger professional backgrounds. The second source of data that we have are the annual reports of the Civil Service Commission. So they have a lot of information about the functioning of this commission, which was basically in charge of overseeing the implementation of the Pendleton Act. Crucially, these reports are going to include a list in which we have every employee who was appointed through an exam to a classified service. So here, for example, we have Weller Ovington, who was appointed while living in the state of Maryland, and who was appointed to a post office, initially making $1,000 a year. And we know when these people were appointed and who they were. So basically, at this point, we have a data set in which we know who worked for the federal government. We link these people to a census, so we also know information about their backgrounds, and we also know which of them were appointed through an exam. So then we're going to use this information to run regressions of the following form. So we want to have some characteristic of employee I, who works in position P and who was hired in year T, where a characteristic is going to be something like the wealth of your parents, whether your father was a professional, etc., etc. We're going to have position fixed effects, meaning that we're always comparing people that were appointed to do exactly the same job, where a position here is going to be defined as the interaction between how much money you make, your compensation, the occupation that you have, the office in which you work, and the department in which you work. So one example would be you are a $1,200 clerk that works in the pension office of the Interior Department. We also going to have a hiding year fixed effect. So we're always going to be comparing within a hiding year. And our interaction of interest is going to be this interaction between being hired in a position that would become subject to exams after 1883 and being hired in the post-reform period, in a kind of differences setup. And then in some specification, we're going to control for other stuff. We start by looking at the family background of these people, and we have a host of characteristics that are based on our linking of these people to the census. So we want to have information on parental wealth. This is based on the wealth that is reported in the 1860 and 1870 censuses. We're going to use this information to rank household heads on the national wealth distribution based on the combined value of real estate and personal wealth. Then we're also going to have the occupation of your parents. We're going to divide occupations into professional, white-collar, non-professional, farmer, skilled, blue-collar, and unskilled. And then we also have a host of demographics. We know where you were born. We know where your parents were born. We know where your parents were literate, and we also know your race. We have a lot of characteristics potentially, so we're going to start by looking at kind of a summary of these characteristics, which is going to be this, what we call the social class summary index, that is basically following this econometrica paper by Katz, Kling, and Liebman, which basically we're going to build such that a higher score corresponds to higher social class. So this is basically what we get. So we're going to look at this difference between people who are in exempted versus non-exempted position relative to excluded category, who are people hired in 1873. And basically what we see is that prior to the passing of the law, these things kind of fluctuate around and oscillate around zero. And after, we get like consistently these things are positive, meaning that there's that people hired through the exam are of consistently higher kind of social status. The next thing we do is to say, well, this is increasing the average of the social class. So But this is consistent with, potentially very different stories. So, one story is a story in which really people at the very top of the distribution are gaining at the expense of the middle, but it's also consistent with a story where the middle class is gaining at the expense of the bottom. And, we cannot really know what's the case from the average. So what we do is we want to split families based on quintiles of the wealth distribution, and then look at the relative representation of each quintile in the bureaucracy. And basically what we see is that prior to the reform, the top 20% of the wealth distribution is very overrepresented. However, the bottom 4 quintiles are very similarly represented. There doesn't seem to be much of a gradient between parental wealth quintiles and relative representation. However, after the reform, this changes, and the 60 to 80 group is going to gain representation mostly at the expense of the bottom of the distribution. And this is also true when we look at this in a regression framework where the different outcomes are whether you belong to one of these groups. Then we kind of unpack this index and we look at other characteristics. We want to find that these people have parents with kind of higher status occupations. They're more likely to be children of professionals, less likely to have a blue-collar father. And then there's also a change in the demographics. There are fewer immigrants, fewer children of immigrants. However, we find no change in the share of whites in the federal administration. So the last thing I want to say is, what do we think is going on here? Why do we think that exams reduce the representation of applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds? And we have a very simple story in which basically what happens is that the exams benefit what we call educated outsiders. These are people that have high levels of education, yet relatively limited levels of connections. And we argue that the middle class is going to gain because they were overrepresented in this group. We have a very simple conceptual framework that illustrates this argument, in which basically the likelihood that you will get a position in the federal administration depends on how educated you are, but also on how connected you are. And there's some weight to each of these factors. And basically, we think of the reform as basically increasing the relative weight of education in the hiring process. So basically, what the reform does is to benefit people that have high values of E, education, and low values of C, that we call educated outsiders. However, it's not obvious which social group is going to be overrepresented in this category. And this is going to depend on how education and connections are related to family wealth. So for instance, we can have a society in which there is very little correlation between family wealth and education. And in such society, such a reform, would help the poor. However, we might have a society in which there is a strong link between education and social class. And in such society, the effects might be very different. So we're going to show evidence that is consistent with this interpretation. And basically, we have kind of two groups of evidence. One is to show that indeed these people are more likely to be educated outsiders, meaning they're more likely to be educated, that we capture by two things: your occupation prior to joining the bureaucracy, and then measures of how good your access to educational resources was in the county in which you grew up. And second is that we're also going to show that these people are less likely to be connected. And we want to proxy for connections, looking at things such as where your father was a bureaucrat, where you grew up in DC, and a measure based on voting patterns in the county in which you grew up. So basically what we find is that these people are much more likely to have a professional occupation prior to joining the bureaucracy. They're also much more likely to come from a county that had a high number of per capita schools. And this is not just driven by very broad differences across places. This is also true once we look within a state of residence. It's also true when we condition on characteristics of the parents. It's also the case that these people are less likely to be connected. They're less likely to have grown up in DC, less likely to have a father who was a government employee, less likely to have to come from a county that voted for the incumbent party. I think I'm out of time, so let me just conclude by saying that basically what we find is that exams increase the elitism among public employees. This effect was quite persistent, so even after 10 years after the passing of the reform, we find that these people are still of a higher social status. And one remarkable feature here is that this happened despite the exam was based on content that in principle was relatively broadly accessible. It was not based on kind of very technical or academic content. So we think that a broad implication of this is that exams are often described as this kind of equity efficiency panacea. We show some evidence that these efficiency gains might come at the expense of equity, and we think that another broad lesson is that it's important to think about the counterfactual to exams and how that might also shape the composition of the selected people. And that's it. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for being very much right on time. And so Guo Shu is our discussant. Is he virtual or here? Virtual?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. I guess we probably need to stop sharing your screen and
Is Guo here? I don't see him.
No.
So you remember that you mentioned that he has,
right? Yeah, no. He did say that his remarks would be brief. This is maybe at the extreme of brief. So, given that our discussant is not here yet, why don't we take questions from the audience, both here and virtually? And so go ahead.
So I was surprised by your conclusion at the end.
Okay.
Because I actually thought your data showed that exams really help people in the 60th to 80th percentile, right? Which is sort of what you feel now, that abolishing exams is pushing down the options of the 60th percentile, which I happen to be in. So I think it's a pretty important issue.
Sure, you can some of it because out there in virtual land, probably need to do that.
Well, now it seems so official. So my name is Marie Devin from Community College in New Hampshire. Yep. I thought your paper was outstanding and very fascinating.
Thank you.
And really a lot of data collection too. So I was surprised at the conclusion why you thought that the exams increased inequality, because I could see that, but what hit me is that exams are a benefit to people in the 60th to 80th percentile, because I've noticed in the college application process recently, I turned 18, so also, they've abolished the exams. Well, not completely, but a hedge fund has taken over the SAT, and it's no longer really very good. So, and I thought that what you show is that abolishing exams will harm the chances of a 60th to 80th percentile. So, and perhaps I only think that's important because me and probably most of my friends lie in that percentile. But I just wondered if you could speak to that a little more.
Yeah, so it's true. So we do find that when you introduce exams, this is not helping people at the very top of the distribution. So they sort of keep a similar representation both before and after. It does hurt people at the bottom. This is coming at the expense of, it helps people in the 60 to 80 group, but this is coming at the expense of people at the bottom. So, I guess it depends on how much weight you want to put into each of these groups. I think under most reasonable social welfare functions, you would think that is an increase in inequality, but, it really depends a little bit on how much weight you want to give to each of these groups in your kind of social utility at some point. That makes sense? Sure.
Thanks for welcome, President. Nice to see you. Yeah, we had sort of a same question, I guess. So because you guys are linking over time, so you're sampling men, right? So
we actually try to link women also, and we do find some. So, and this is not too surprising because it's very rare for women like the intersection of women who are married and work is extremely limited. And since we're looking at a sample of working women, we do have women in the sample actually.
Yeah, so I was just wondering sort of what percentage of the bureaucrats were women, and therefore like what percentage approximately, and then who you lose versus who you keep with the matching strategy.
So the
sort of context setting field.
Yes, so I don't know the answer to the first question. I don't know the answer. I don't know the gender composition by this. I don't know this. It's easy to check, but I don't know it. So something I didn't mention about the context of the reform, just because it was so brief, is that, of course, you might ask, why don't we have gender as an outcome? So why don't we look at the relative representation of different genders in the bureaucracy? And part of the reason is that the reform is not fully meritocratic along the gender dimension, in the sense that the appointing officer could still request something like a male clerk. And there was kind of a separate list of eligibles like by gender. So we because of that, we didn't think that this is like a very good setting to look at changes in kind of relative representation by gender, because it's not really it's not really like a meritocratic competition at some point. We do find a little bit of less women in the sample, so the matching rates are definitely a bit lower for women. We do have some results in the paper in which we do not rely on linking. So since we do observe, for instance, the place of birth of people, there are certain outcomes. So for instance, where you're a migrant, that we can directly observe from the registers without having to link people. So we have some exercise in which what we do is to compare our estimates in the linked sample vis-a-vis the non-linked sample and see how the coefficients compare. And we actually find that they're really very comparable. So we're not so worried about differential selection into a sample interacting with the exam kind of messing up our results, but yeah, it's something that we discuss really at length in the paper. Yeah, thank you.
So you showed us your data, so we know that you have data that traces out people's potential careers in the bureaucracy.
Yes.
So one interesting question for you to think about, not for this paper, but for a subsequent paper, is do the exams create people, because the investment to getting appointed is different, people who persist longer in the bureaucracy? And then the other question is, are the people who are in that group that is relatively more advantaged, which is the fourth quartile, more likely to persist longer because they got into exams than the people who, in some sense, in some counterfactual world, were excluded, depending on connections for getting appointed? When those connections left Washington, they left with them.
Yes, no, great comment. So actually, we have a second paper in which we focus a lot on the. Yes, so this issue of turnover is super important. So one reason why. So there are kind of two motives why you might find that these people persist more. One is that maybe there's an increasing quality of people, so these people end up staying longer. The other, however, is a little bit makes interpretation a bit harder, and it is that the incentives to fire people who are not performing are lower now, because now you cannot replace this person with your friends. Basically, it has to be so. In a way, you are kind of affecting both the incentives to remove people and also the selection of people. So that, in a way, changes a little bit the interpretation of the turnover results. We do find that there is more. We do find, and we have another paper in which we have a bit of a better variation to look at this, but we do find that basically this reduces turnover. So, and in particular, it reduces what we think is political turnover, which is turnover that happens when the federal administration changes political hands. So we do find this, it's really a very large effect, basically.
This may be a question for a follow-up paper, but I'm interested in what were the impacts of this reform for the effectiveness of government. To my understanding, this time the U.S. federal government is shrinking, or it's maybe not growing with the economy. And so I'm really curious to know, what did these people do? Did they change policy in any way? Wherever they sent out the West or something like that? So what was the impact?
Great question. So we actually have a kind of the first paper actually we wrote on this topic was exactly about that. So, this is still not published, so but we do have a working paper in which basically what we look at the customs service in the US. And basically the advantage of that setting is that a collection district that had 50 or more employees by 1883 had to recruit their employees through competitive exams, whereas those with fewer than 50 could keep business as usual. So basically what we do in this paper is to look at how efficient these collection districts are in collecting customs revenue by looking at basically a measure of revenue collected divided by expenses. Of course, there are multiple things that the government do that we cannot capture in a quantitative way, but this is like one thing that we can measure. And actually, quite surprisingly, we find that there's not much of an effect on performance, even though we do find effects in terms of things that you might think are associated with performance, such as, we find a less turnover among the employees. The employees look better in terms of professional background. However, we find that this doesn't really translate into improved efficiency. We have like a long discussion of why we think that this is the case. I think I'm not going to bore you with it's probably too long, the answer. But yeah, we are very interested in this question also.
We're just out of time for this paper, so why don't we move on? And now we are moving to the world of a virtual presenter and a local discussant. And unfortunately,
all right.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you on Zoom.
Okay, but in the room, can you hear me? Or?
We can hear you. It's a little bit fuzzy.
Okay, so should I start or should we fix something before?
You can begin now, and I will keep you apprised of time in the chat.
Yeah, because I can't hear the room. Oh, not very well, at least.
I think you can go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would start. So thank you to the organizers for taking our paper. I'm very glad to present you this paper entitled The Origins of Elite Persistence, co-authored with Toke from Cambridge and Pierre-Guillaume from Université Libre de Bruxelles. So basically the idea of that paper was just to start with a puzzling fact, and we have some example on the slide, but I'm pretty sure that if you think of your own country, you will find a group of elite that persisted over time, even if you change political regimes, even after democratic transition or some autocratic reversal. And we know from previous research that this persistence of elites is detrimental for growth, institutions, and electoral competition. And we somehow miss explanation of this persistence. So some people say it comes from investment in de facto power, but then we miss information on what this investment might be. So it might be wealth and weapons, the suppression of electoral competition, or just better political skills from some elites. And we still miss some theory of what we call in the paper democratic purges. It could also, it's synonym to lustration. So the purge is happening at democratic transitions, and that will determine the set of available politicians in the new regime. And France is one example, but it also happens in Poland, in Chile, or South Africa, and it's not exhaustive. And we don't have any clear empirical evidence to answer two questions. The first one is, do elites actually survive political transition? So are we going beyond anecdotes? And more specifically, is elite persistence distorted? So are some elites more likely than others to persist? And we lack causal estimates of this distortion. And the second question is, how can some elite maintain de facto power? So what is the form of this investment allowing some kind of elite to stay in power after a political transition? And by answering, or at least trying to answer these two questions, we take part in different strands of literature. One was political selections, also huge literature on elite persistence within political regimes. But the one we're really contributing to is the burgeoning literature on elite persistence after political transitions. And we know of one paper by Gonzalez and co-author looking at mayors in Chile and showing that they have an incumbency advantage in the first election after the transition. But still, we don't really know what determines the pool of candidates in those elections. So how the purges after political transition or during a political transition might work. And so to answer this question, we go back in time and I stay in France, but you travel to France. And we look at the process happening after World War II, so just a small timeline. So during World War II, the Vichy regime was aligned on Nazi Germany and administering the country. From August 1944, there's a transitional power taking place. And so all acts taken by the Vichy regime are declared void. And we have first elections happening from April 1945 and the constitution of the Fourth Republic happening at the end of 46. Right before these elections, what we call the jury d'honneur is created. And the process to purge politicians that have been somehow involved with the Vichy regime started. And what is very good for us with these purges is they are super documented. And so we know how the selection process occurred in France in April 1945. And so France set up this special code, the jury d'honneur. And by purging, we mean declaring a politician ineligible. Defendants are all MPs having voted full powers to Marshal Pétain in 1940 or members of Vichy institutions. Clearance rule is quite obvious, active participation in the resistance before 1943. But the procedure is quite peculiar. So each defendant faced two different levels of courts. The first one is composed of local courts called Comité départemental de libération. And these local courts will issue a first decision on each defendant. And then a second court, the national court, the one I told you about before, the jury d'honneur will gather extra proofs and rule. And by extra proofs, we mean administrative reports and letters of support from some supporters of defendants. And when we look at the archives of this process, now you have access to all individual dossiers of defendants in front of that national court. You find that defendants themselves were complaining about connections. So some defendants sent letter to the jury accusing the jury of partiality. One of them even wrote to General de Gaulle saying it's not about justice, it's about connections. Okay, it's in their own interest to complain about the process just to prove their case. But in the dossier, we also find proofs of these connections actually taking place. So a defendant actually wrote to the president of the jury saying, okay, people told me to use my connections. Some others wrote to the brother of the president of the jury, and so on and so forth. So we have evidence that people were actually trying to activate connections while their case was under study. And then we turned to the jury, and we got interested in who were the members of the jury d'honneur. So René Cassin was a law graduate from Aix-Marseille and Paris, and he was defined as the jurist of Free France in the Dictionary of the French Resistance. André Pessalviner was also a law graduate from Paris, also went to the École Libre des Sciences Politiques, which became Sciences Po later on. And Maxime Bloch-Mascar was also a member of this school. And why is it so interesting, the background of the jury members? It's because it's reflecting the composition of the political elites in France. Before World War II, so you have another representation of lawyers and law graduates. Around 28% of French members of parliaments are law graduates right at the beginning of the war. But they also held super important positions. So 13 French premiers out of 19 were lawyers in the interwar period in France. During the purges, as I just told you, all members of the jury are somehow connected to Parisian law universities. And after World War II, we observed that lawyers also persist and are still in French politics. We also know that it's a cohesive milieu because they have clubs, bar associations, speech contests, so they mingle together. And so to see if actually connections were taking place and if lawyers were better at using connections, we'll use data on the individual characteristics of all MPs facing this process. So we have religion, age, occupation, political mandates, role in the assembly, a lot of information. And we use a second data set on court decisions to purge politicians. And so we have a bit less than 400 defendants, and we have 2 decisions per defendant. So we end up with 800 observations. And what we do in our exercise is to consider the characteristics of the groups for which the 2 levels of courts didn't agree on. So meaning the local courts was in favor of acquitting the defendant, but the national court diverged, or the opposite. And if you consider the 2 decisions we have on each case, they might be explained by 3 types of factors. The first one would be court characteristics. So one court might be more lenient than the other. And so this characteristic will apply to all defendants in front of one court. This decision might come from defendant characteristics, so statistical bias, some characteristics correlating with guiltiness. And so it will apply to some groups of defendants showing these characteristics in front of both courts. And then the third component is the one we are interested in, and it's how a specific court treats an individual characteristics. And then it will apply to a group sharing these characteristics in front of a specific court. And so after controlling for 1 and 2, we can capture this third component, and we call that the specific advantage one specific group as before one specific court. And so it calls for definitive estimates. And so we'll estimate the probability that a defendant will be acquitted in front of court C. We'll add defendant fixed effect or group fixed effects. We will have fixed effect for the different type of courts. And then we have the interaction between courts and defendant characteristics. So here, the law graduate characteristics to see if law graduates actually were better in front of the jury than in front of local courts. What is good is that each defendant faced the 2 levels of courts, so we have no selection of defendants unobservable. And just a first grasp on our results, what we observe is that in front of the local court, so on the left, we do not observe a strong difference between law graduates in black and other defendants. And then the difference is higher in front of the national court, so the jury d'honneur. And basically, that's the same results, but in a regression table. And we observed that law graduates had 9 to 10 percentage points higher probability to be acquitted in front of the national court compared to the local court. What we do in the second column is to add a lot of control variables and their interaction with the court's variable as well, to be sure that we are not capturing any other biases or any other advantages correlated group might have. And the effect is still of the same magnitude. So our effect does not depend on other individual characteristics or doesn't depend on information on resistance activities, because we have this information in the dossier, so we are even able to control for that and the interaction with the court. We run some balance tests and so on, and we're pretty sure of that effect. In the second estimation, we're trying to see when does this advantage of law graduates appear, and actually it appears when they run for election afterwards. So it might be kind of a first step towards the persistence of those elites. And results are robust to some tests. I will go through that quite quickly and go to the next part directly. And so maybe the most interesting part, at least for me, is to know, okay, we have these law graduates and they fare better in front of the jury, but why? And so to answer that question, we will do it in two parts. So first, we'll see if the dossier of law graduates in front of the jury were any different than the files of others. And so we'll test differences in files content between groups of defendants. And in the second part, we'll test if these differences are actually explaining the difference in acquittal rates afterwards. And so we went to the archives of the jury d'honneur. We gathered 17,000 documents in individual dossiers, so we know the investigation of the jury. We have administrative reports, intelligence services, and we have letters of support. So what you have to know about these letters of support is basically when an investigation was open for a case back then, anybody could send a letter to the jury claiming that the defendant was either innocent or guilty. But in most cases, it was to claim his innocence. Here on the right pie chart, you have the composition of these letters of support. A lot of them are coming from the resistance. A bit of them are private, so we don't really know. In most cases, it's coming from constituents. We have a bit from administration and politicians. And so we look at the particularities of this dossier, and one dimension we find differences between law graduates and others is what we call indirect connections. So we do not find any more letters of support for law graduates than for other defendants, but we find more letters of support from Paris. We find more supporters from Paris. And we find, on average, more connections between supporters and the jury, meaning that supporters of law graduates actually also acted as informants in other cases. So the jury could trust the supporters of law graduates, whereas for others, we do not find such an effect. When we control for this dimension of the dossier and interact it with the type of decisions, so on two dimensions, is it a decision by the jury on law graduates, or is it a decision by the jury on other defendants, and the same for local courts? We do find that somehow it explains part of our effect. So our main effect, so the jury times law graduates interaction, is not statistically significant anymore, and the magnitude decreases a bit. When we're comparing the magnitude of the coefficients of these triple interactions, we do find a specific effect of letters of support coming from Paris for law graduates. So law graduates were somehow better at activating this legal milieu in Paris when facing the jury, and it explains their higher acquittal rate. When we're looking at connections, it's actually not specific to law graduates, and a good connected other defendant might also benefit from these connections, and to increase his acquittal rate as well. But both connections and this activation of the network of supporters from Paris mattered to explain the acquittal rates of the graduates in front of the jury. And so we do not find any other explanation. So it's not because they have better skills or any other differences in their dossier. Direct connections are not explaining our results. And I think I have to rush. So just to finish, this study shows that somehow even in new democracies, political selection might be biased. And the very first step of the political selection process, when you want to get rid of potential authoritarian threats. And this advantage is in part explained by indirect connections. And I don't see you, but I thank you for your attention.
So thank you. Jean, can you hear me? Okay. So this is a paper about persistence of elites, and I want to be clear about what I think the paper does, which is a very deep dive in the fate of French MPs who voted to establish the Vichy regime in June of 1940. So it's important to remember Vichy was a dictatorship that was voted by the last democratic elected assembly and Senate in France. The problem is, in the fall of 1944, the summer of 1944, prior to holding the elections, de Gaulle and his allies, who had recovered France after the US
liberated most of France in 1944, had to decide who could stand for elections. The process for reviewing the individuals who had been MPs in the past and therefore were good candidates because of their local connections to be re-elected in 1944 involved a local board and a national board. The national board reviewed everyone, so what's important here is they have no selection. It's not people chose to appeal a negative decision at the local level, everybody got reviewed twice. Now, this is an unusual second statement I want to make. This paper is complicated for me for two reasons. One, I have relatives, or had relatives, who were killed under the Vichy regime. More problematic for me, at least, is that some of you will know the national board was composed of three members, one of whom is the father of a co-author. André Postel-Vinet is the father of Gilles Postel-Vinet, with whom I've been working for 30 years. I did not know that when I accepted to comment on this paper, and I think the authors will realize this is not a central part of what I have to say. But I do feel a little conflicted about all this, but then again, these days we're often conflicted by life. So what happened? What did this process of review produce? 3/4 of the MPs, give or take, were stripped of their electability. 1/4 were exonerated, allowed to continue their political careers. The paper establishes that law graduates are much more likely to be exonerated MPs who had no legal background, and that this is not correlated with other observables. Moreover, this difference arises at the National Committee, that trio of very well-respected early joiners of de Gaulle with impeccable resistance credentials. The argument, which is not implausible, is that the law school buddy system helped law graduates survive the political transition. Although, frankly, if you are a graduate of Montpellier or Bordeaux, I don't quite understand why somebody from Sciences Po would care at all about you. So there is a narrower test you could impose, which is if these people have similar law school backgrounds, because these are very tight, narrow connections. But in any case, the argument is that the law school buddy system helped law school graduates survive the political transition. And to be honest, the idea that André Postel-Vinet was part of the buddy system makes me uncomfortable, but that's the way it is. So my comments are there's 7 comments. They start very narrowly, and they won. First off, the statistical work is impeccable. If anything, there's too much of it. Because once you have the balance test, you kind of know that this effect of law graduate is just going to be there. So there's no doubt that law graduates survive the purge at higher rates, and so there's going to be an issue that's going to come back, which is how do we interpret this? Second, I have a suggestion for presentation. They were given a rule, which is you can only exonerate people who were active in the resistance before 1943 or had joined the Free French Army. So if we use those predictors, how many people should have been exonerated? Right now, being in the resistance is a little bit ambiguous, so you have to play with that. But you could just ask, what if they had applied the algorithm that was suggested to them? You're going to get a result. And then you can plug in your law graduate. You're going to get the same result on your law graduate before, because I don't think that's going to change. But it's going to help understand the bias that second level administration did in a more transparent way from the way that the paper is doing it now. It will be very interesting to see how these variables influence acquittal, because that's what you should have done. Third, how important is the effect of the higher acquittal rate of lawyers to the persistence of the elite? On the one hand, lawyers are 10% is actually not the right way I think about it. They're almost twice as likely to get acquitted at the jury d'honneur, which is the second stage, than conditional have been convicted in the first stage, than non-lawyers. So that seems to be a big effect. On the other hand, if one applies the crude exoneration rate to non-lawyers to lawyers, we would have exonerated 26 out of 111, whereas if you do it in actuality, you got 34 out of 11. So 8 additional lawyers, it's not a big elite. So the issue is this a big number or a small number? So it's a statistically well-established number. There seems to be a large elasticity, but I'm not yet persuaded that this tells me something about the persistence of the Vichy elite in France. I'm looking for a number that says 8,000, not 8. And I think you can do that, by the way. So we'll come back to that. What was the fate of the exonerated? So the paper essentially stops. And this is unfair because it's an enormous amount of work to do what they did. The paper essentially stops at the end of 1944 when the electoral lists are done. When the jury is done, we're done. But we want to know if the elites are going to persist. Do these people get exonerated, stand for election? Do they get elected? Because if they stand for election and never get elected, then that's not the mechanism through which the elite persists. I am very well aware that a large fraction of the Vichy elite persisted in France. I don't think that's an issue of debate. The question is how. So we need to know a little bit more than what you've done, and I think you can probably nail that. Did they not stand for election but reemerge in government? Right? Because if you were exonerated, could that mean that you ended up getting into a position into the judiciary, which had to be purged very heavily because the judiciary was very complicit in a lot of very, very bad things that the Vichy government did? Fifth, and here I will admit that I'm being a little unfair. I think the paper needs to balance better the very broad claims it makes about elite persistence and the very narrow focus on 398 individuals. And I think you need to sort of work on this. The paper is less about elite persistence and an evaluation of the bias of a particular committee's work in a much larger purge. Okay? It's very important work, but it's quite partial. To give you an example, France is organized in 90-odd departments and 400 or so arrondissements, each of which had a prefect and a sub-prefect, which in 1943 was executing the orders of the Vichy government. Most famous of these interesting people was a guy named Maurice Papon, who was in Bordeaux, was directly active in deporting Jews to the concentration camps, who survived to be the prefect of police, and this is important given the time that we are, of Paris in 1961. And in September 1961, there was a very large demonstration in favor of independence in Algeria. The police intervened and threw people in the Seine who died. Papon was prosecuted very late in his life. So the de Gaulle regime had to do something about figuring out who he was going to take or not take, and somehow Papon survived. But there's more of them. So you already counted 490 or so important officials that are not going to be purged through this particular process. You can also go a little further. Ministries are organized in bureaus. We could actually, to each of the bureau chiefs, these are going back to Santiago's issue, they're in the French civil servant register. And it's very difficult for me to believe that somebody who was in a bureau of the army at the top of that bureau, right, the head of the spy bureau, something like that, isn't complicit. What did they do with these people? And then you can, the other interesting thing, that France has 40,000 municipalities, which each have a municipal council of 6 people. So if you're going to start doing a purge, you can get to very, very large numbers of people who were part of a system that was at least complicit with Vichy, not necessarily active, and you want to know what happened. So this is unfair because you've done fantastic work on 490 people, but because you've done that, I want more. Finally, if you're not Mao or Stalin, purges have to have their limits because you want to keep the government operational. Right? You can't fire 40,000 mayors. You will not, they're responsible for establishing civil, birth and death records. There's all this stuff that needs to happen. And the US had a strange realization that firing every officer in the Iraqi army was not a good idea. So these things really do matter. So you have to make some issue. And I want to give you one example that I find really fascinating. There's 2 parts to this. German rocket scientists were directly responsible for participating in a system of production that relied on slave labor camps. Some of them were captured by the Russians and ended up working in the Russian rocketry system. Some of them were captured by the Americans and ended up providing, right? Werner von Braun was working on developing rockets that were produced by slave labor. We never said anything about that. We were only interested in building our own rockets. So we ourselves are in a situation where, at least for scientists and some things of this sort, we make these things. But the interesting part is not that. So when these guys were captured in Germany and went to Russia, they went to work for a group of people that were building rockets in the 1930s. If you remember, 1930s were a hard time for many people in Russia because there were lots of purges. So if you read Asif Siddiqui's book called Red Rockets Glare, you will find a chapter in which the core group that developed the rockets that fired Sputnik are purged. They go to prison and they have to continue their work in prison until the purge is reversed because the government can't do without them. So the interesting question for you is there any way for you to determine whether they preserved more lawyers because they needed lawyers for a variety of purposes? That is, they were, what Castempo, Salvini, and the third person were up there doing things and they had to make compromises. And you picked these 3 people who were impeccable because nobody's going to question their compromise, but you were really asking them to do compromise, not to get to the truth. And I think that's a really interesting set of questions. But anyway, I really look forward to reading more of your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
we have about 5 minutes for questions. I gather that this microphone, while it works in the room, doesn't really help with Zoom. So if you have a question, probably what you need to do is to come up here to the podium and use this mic, because that way our speaker can hear you. So are there questions, comments? Nothing else, no? Going once, twice, sold to the man in the corner, no. No, would you like to have a moment to respond to any of the comments that from the discussant?
No, just a huge thanks to Jean-Laurent for his well-thought comments. Just maybe out of clarity, we do observe this advantage appearing mostly for Parisian law graduates, so the ones that belong to this group. And second, we do not infer any malicious plans or whatever from defendants or from the jury. We're just saying information was easier to verify if you belong to the same network. And for all the reasons you've mentioned, like having this verification through people that also served as informant for other cases and so on might be a way to get higher clearance. I really thank you for all the comments. It's very, very helpful, and we're gathering more data on the fate of people, so we'll tell you more about elite persistence in the future as well. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. And then I guess we can move to our third paper, and Rowena, you're going to present that? So, the floor is yours.
Is the thing open? There's the question.
I think it is
Okay.
pretty open, so we'll see it though. It should be one of the options. Okay, great.
Sorry. I need to get rid of this.
Maybe try flipping this way. Maybe flipping back and forth and it will go away.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure though. Are you able to switch slides?
Oh.
No.
Can anyone help to get rid of this? Sorry.
Let's just try to unshare and then share. Sometimes it can get funky when you like select the actual ones. We can go to the desktop. So sorry, this is your.
And that's it.
Okay, let's try this one more. Oh,
Is it, should we just go into it and fix
let's
it?
go. The question is,
I'm gonna like Zoom, I guess, for a second.
It's a full screen if possible.
Sorry, Zoom is a Mac, which makes this hard.
No, that's strange that there's not. It's like. Oh.
I guess we try opening it again or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, now it looks normal.
So now try the
Zoom down. The Zoom? I don't know where it went.
oh, it's up here.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Okay, we got there. So thanks, it's lovely to be here in person and see so many people. This is joint work with Raymond Kim, who is here at the front, who is the second year in our new PhD program at UC Merced. And if this picture looks familiar, it's because Santi and I realized we had selected the same picture as our title slide. And so we're back thinking about the civil service here in this paper. And instead of thinking about the federal introduction of the civil service, we are thinking about cities in the US in the late 19th and early 20th century and looking at police officers, okay? And so as we heard more in Santi's talk, this is the period where we're moving from a situation where mayors come in, they decide they're going to fire all of the public servants or some subset that they don't want and put in their own people into those public service positions like the police. And we're then seeing an evolution and some experimentation at the city level in terms of introducing merit hiring and broader civil service systems. Okay, and so as we saw, the federal civil service comes in some form in 1883. There's also some innovation at the state level during this period, and similarly at the city level. So we're going to have sort of 31 cities in our sample that we're most interested in this paper. And so this is showing you the timeline of when they adopted a civil service system. And so, some New England cities, new places like New York were kind of early in this process, but there's a lot of variation in the timing of adoption of these different policies. Okay. And so when we're thinking about this, how does this apply to the police force? We're thinking of introducing merit in the hiring process at first, introducing some sort of exam, physical tests, mental tests, and having some sort of systematic process for doing hiring. A little later then, more formal systems came into being for promotions, for merit-based promotions, and to formalize the firing processes. Okay, and so our motivation is, looking at this period, how did government develop in the US? How did the efficiency of that government evolve? But also thinking about today when it's still a question in developing countries of, how will we introduce civil service systems? If they want money from international organizations, often it's a requirement to introduce some sort of civil service at different levels of government. And so what can we expect the results to be from those policies? Do they improve the efficiency of government? And do they have unintended consequences in terms of thinking about who are the public servants? Are they representative of the populations they serve? And are they high quality workers? That is one of the main reasons for introducing these systems. So again, our focus is on cities in the US from 1880 through 1940. And we're interested in the following questions, and we'll show you sort of how far we have gotten today in making progress toward answering these questions. And so we're interested in how this new policy changed the type of people who became police officers. Did it affect the quality of these workers by some measures, the skill level or the ability level of these folks? And how did it affect the representativeness of the officers relative to the population? Again, by various criteria. We also want to think about whether ultimately the cities have better outcomes in terms of public safety. And so do we see any impact on arrest rates, which we have some data for, as a result of these policies coming in? Okay, we want to think, so there was some discussion about turnover as a result of Santi's paper and his other work. So turnover is on our agenda as well, to think about will these bureaucracies function more efficiently if we can reduce turnover, which we would expect would be a result of these policies. And so we haven't done as much on that front as yet, but it's on the to-do list. And so, as we'll acknowledge, we have, this is actually Santi's other paper that he referred to. We've certainly taken some inspiration from Diana and Santi's work on the federal civil service, some other work that has been done looking at a slightly later time period and thinking about whether civil service systems improved crime outcomes, and they also found sort of not much effect on those outcomes in this later time period. And our work is also related, and the methods that we use here, to thinking about who gets into particular occupations. And so political jobs has been a big focus of this kind of small but burgeoning literature, thinking about who our elected representatives are, and are they representative of the population or just drawn from elites. So we're sort of referencing that literature as well as the growing development literature on patronage versus civil service systems. So sort of one thing that might come to mind, so I think when we're thinking about political jobs, and there's sort of an obvious implication of power and influence and connections that might be valuable, right? And so we sort of think of those as good jobs. Here, when we're focusing on police officers, was that a good job in this time period? Did that change at all in this time period? And so we have, some evidence from historians that even in the 19th century, where patronage ruled, that it seemed like this was a decent waged job, but there's some uncertainty, right? You could be replaced depending on who gets elected mayor in the next cycle. Okay. In the historical narrative, sort of coming into this project, anything I had read about police, I think was usually from sort of the teens and thinking about like the Boston police strike in 1919. And these kind of time periods where nominal wages that police were paid were eroded by inflation due to a variety of reasons. And so, and also, it was before an era where 8-hour day had been fixed and police were on call for very long periods of time. And so there's some discussion in the historical literature that being a police officer was not a great job in that time period. So before I show sort of some measures that we have later in our time period from 1930 and 1940, I think one thing to acknowledge that we're not addressing today, but we would like to in the future, is to think about, other returns to being a police officer, right? So there's going to be this relationship between politics, the political system, and who becomes a police officer, and what the police is up to, right? And so there's what the police gets paid, and there's sort of the, potential corrupt activities that are going on, which might also have a lucrative return for being in the police. Okay, so what we can tell from census data that we've looked at so far, looking at people who were police officers in 1930 and 1940 in our cities, it looks like they're doing pretty well by measures of their average wage compared to other male workers in the population. It looks like they're doing pretty well on house values and housing rents as well, right? So they seem to be, their distribution of those things seems to be at a higher level compared to other groups. And so we'll show you some measures of that. So sorry, these are CDFs. This is income that we're looking at, comparing the police to all male workers of similar age. That's the top left panel. We have male workers at similar levels of Oxford, similar occupational status, and we have municipal workers and firefighters that we're comparing them to. Okay, so police are always the boys in blue here. Okay, they're the blue line, if you can discern colors actually, and the red line are the other groups. And so it looks like the police are doing pretty well here in terms of the distribution of income, looking at the 1940 census. If we look at house values, similarly, these are actually significantly different, these distributions, and the police live in houses that are slightly higher value. Okay. Okay, so police seems to be a good job in 1930 and 1940. Whether it was throughout the whole time period is still something we want to investigate. So just to note that. So what is the data that we bring to this project? So in other work, I have collected annual police reports for these cities and put together a range of crime statistics based on those reports. And these reports often also contain a roster of who were police officers. Okay, and so we can reconstruct career histories based on these rosters. They may contain the name and the rank, sometimes addresses, birthplace, year appointed, previous occupation, which we're interested in, and also their current salary. Okay, so wherever we have any of this information, we have collected it all. And so these are going to be useful for looking at turnover. And so because we don't quite have everything cleaned exactly the way we want it yet, we haven't created those measures of turnover yet, but that's something we can do. Today, we'll show you more evidence based on census data. And so we have also linked people across time who were police officers and our sort of interested comparison groups. And we link them back so we can look at an occupation when they were younger before they became police officers. Okay. We have some information on civil service adoption from a couple of sources. We haven't used this yet. We have some information about what are the different forms of government. That's another sort of dimension of policy experimentation in this period, which also could have actually been more important for who became a police officer relative to civil service. So think about moving from a strong mayor system where the mayor has control over public servants to some other council or commission form where you're more likely you're probably more likely to have a civil service system, but you also may get away from 100% mayor control over those jobs. Okay, so this is what they look like. We have a very simple one from New Bedford on the left. So the minimum we have usually is rank and name. Sometimes we also have all of this lovely detail, which we have for Cleveland in 1900. Okay. And so our measures so far, we've looked at representativeness in just a fairly simple way so far. So we'll just show you some summary statistics for police versus comparison groups and in general versus the male working age population of the city. When we think about previous worker equality, who's entering the police force, what is their skill level beforehand, we're using that previous occupation measure that we get from linking them backward in the census. Sometimes we can get that from the rosters. So if we can use both of these sources. We also are linking back to fathers to look at, we could use this as a proxy for ability or worker quality or just social status and family background in general. And again, those comparison groups are sort of working males who are in the same age range as police. We also then look at people in the same occupational status. So these are the jobs that fall into the same OX score. And there's a variety of industrial and non-industrial jobs here. We look at municipal workers and then firefighters. And so, why are we doing this? Well, we want to compare to working males in general, but also, thinking about who selects into trying to get these jobs, it's probably a more similar group is trying to be a firefighter, trying to be a municipal worker. Okay, so in terms of representativeness of comparing, here we're just comparing means mostly. We look at distributions sometimes as well of snapshots of time from the census. Who is a police officer in a particular census, comparing them to these comparison groups. Okay, and so what we find is there are some differences in these groups. The police is not fully representative of the population. They tend to be sort of older, more likely to be married, tied to family, have more children. Okay, so they, sort of consistent with a sort of a stable people in a stable job, right? That's what they seem to represent. Where we have larger cities in particular, we find that they are not representative in terms of race, right? So the police forces are mostly not integrated in this period, and they have fewer immigrants than they should compared to the population. Okay. So for 1910, this is what we look like, okay, in terms of police. So they're most similar to the municipal and the firefighters, and there's some general differences as I just outlined. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip to the quality question, okay? So what we do is we look at previous occupation, and we're trying to see what part of the distribution the police is drawn from, okay? Are they lower quality or higher quality on average compared to our comparison groups? And then once we bring in the civil service, does that change at all, okay? And so here's how the CDFs of previous OC score look for the police versus these other groups. And these are statistically different. I think firefighters is closest to the police here, and police is usually lower quality than these other groups based on previous occupation. Showing you the regression here. So if we focus on column 2, because I think that's all I have time for. So we have a negative on police here. So the police is drawn from a lower part of the distribution, the people entering the force. But some of this is eroded by bringing in the civil service. Okay, so we see a positive coefficient here on civil police times civil service. These are fairly small effects. So there's a small negative selection into the police force, which is brought back a little bit by bringing in the civil service. Okay. The last thing I'll say, since I am running out of time. So next steps, as I said, are to look at turnover. We want to also look at more crime outcomes to think about how did the actual provision of public services improve or disimprove as these measures came in and the police changed in characteristics a little bit. Here's one regression which looks at that. So we have our arrest measures up here. We have public order offenses, felonies, property crimes, and violent crimes. And we don't see any effect of bringing in the civil service. However, we don't have our full data set here. These are just our census years. And so we can enrich this data set. We actually have more crime information that we can bring in. And okay, thank you for giving me 1 or 2 extra minutes. And I look forward to Rob's comments.
All right, Rob, the floor is yours.
Is that coming through okay? And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. A little bit sad that I can't be there in person, but I have a mix and match vaccine, so no visiting the US until November 8th. I'm joining you from the homeland of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the outskirts of Toronto today. And so this is a really neat early stage piece of research. So I'm going to do less of the kind of digging into what needs to be done differently amongst what has already been done. And I'm just really excited about all the places this particular project and this research agenda can go. So I'm going to focus on things from that perspective. Now, even from the really early stage of the research, it's clear what the big research questions are going to be. I think that the authors really underplay this basic question around, was policing a good job? But right, we don't actually really know the answer to that in the qualitative history. Right, it is highly debated in this period. Like I would say that my reading of that history is that. I think there's a reasonable case that it was not a good job at the end of the 19th century, but certainly by the period covered, right, we now have some nice quantitative evidence that it looks like a pretty reasonable job. And maybe that qualitative history kind of pre-police union is not accurate, right? And so I think pulling that story back is going to be really important. The other parts are where Rowena focused, right? So I would say that the core of the paper now is who is becoming a cop. Do they represent their community, and what type of selection into policing do we see? And where is the paper going? It's looking at turnover and the impacts of ending the spoils system on turnover and looking at crime-based outcomes, where we have some other evidence, but not kind of point in time. And so that would be really valuable. On the approach, right, so we've got all these beautiful new records, super valuable. I think that there are going to be a bundle of papers that can come out of them. So I do want to put that on display, right, having these police rosters, even if it's only for 31 cities, right, it's a lot of officers. It's a long period of time. We have fine data on, for example, hierarchies within departments, and that's valuable. And so what's happening now is those folks are being matched to the census, pulled back in time, and then comparisons between officers in different control groups. We have a formalized difference in difference around prior occupation, looking at officer quality, And then there's a bunch of stuff to come, thinking about turnover within departments, thinking about crime outcomes, potentially with intergenerational mobility. I think those are all valuable. To me, a lot of the big contributions are kind of in the core policing literature. This is really the intersection of economics of policing and economic history of this period, right? It's pretty vacant. And so there are so many important questions that can be tackled. In terms of the results, what are the authors finding so far? Policing looks like a good job. That is a meaningful contribution. I want to see that pulled out. It looks like there's some modest negative selection into policing. That modest negative selection is counteracted by a modest positive impact of meritocratic reforms. And potentially the most important part, right, and given what we know about policing today, and we do need to figure out whether or not it carries back in time, is that even if we're getting a little bit of better selection into who becomes an officer, right, police are becoming, especially with respect to their immigrant status, look much less like their communities after these reforms. And so, right, this hints at this trade-off between, right, quotation marks officer quality and their quotation marks their ability, and do they look like their neighbors? And which of those leads to better outcomes? And I would say that this is a debate that we're still having, and we can inform it with this historical work. So on the contribution front, again, this is early stage. I don't want to push things too far, but I think we already see some of these popping up. Right, so this adds to this burgeoning literature on meritocracy. That's lovely. I already talked through the findings there. It gives us a lens into a period where I know in some of Rowena's other work, this is a statistical dark age for policing. Yeah, we don't know that much. And so this is giving us a lens into that period. The results on what happens to police departments after these meritocratic reforms align with Ronagi 2019. So we're seeing, maybe like that paper finds these big crime impacts, but in terms of what the force looks like internally, these reforms don't seem to be having a big impact. And that's starting to look like a consistent result. And then, the other area where I view there as being large contributions, right, is this does have implications for policy today, even from this early stage. So, up here north of the border, being a police officer is pretty reliably a good job with respect to your wage, right? You're making six figures in pretty much every jurisdiction. If we look south of the border, you have variation state by state and community by community where an officer could make as little as $38,000 a year to municipalities where they make $100,000, right? So I know that this is framed up as a kind of linking to development economics, but I think that policing compensation and employment standards are a bit of a Wild West in the United States. And so I actually think that there's direct implications for policy design in the US. And then two, I talked about this already, but right, there are these implications for what is the right HR reform practice, right? I think that there is a natural tendency to think that meritocracy is going to be lovely and have these great outcomes. And right, the Ornagi's paper does find these outcomes. But if there's a cost in terms of the representativeness of the police force, right, we know that there are potentially these large offsetting impacts for minority communities. And as the paper as it stands now mentions, and quite importantly, right, who we're thinking about as minority communities differs here, right? There's very little representation of African Americans in these departments, but we do have meaningful shifts in representation amongst different immigrant communities. So just walking through a couple general thoughts and then some targeted thoughts. I think one of the big advantages of this work is that we're looking at early treatment. I think that there's lots of reasons to think that late treatment might look different. I think that the authors should lean into that. I think that I think the real strength in where this work is going to go is not going to be in the cross-city work, unfortunately, but it's right, these full work histories of officers, right? We know potentially when you're going into the force, what your life looks like then. We know what it looks like later. And we can pin down who's getting promoted, why are they getting promoted, and what's going on under the hood of departments. And that can be, right, even today, that's not easy data to get. So I would lean into that. Now, the two targeted areas. So one, with respect to variation in kind of the change in institutions. So one, the paper right now talks about how right, they're going to compare across these reforms being applied to other groups of workers. I think that's a no-brainer. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you can also do some work to strengthen the results, for example, around some type of brothers approach. But I think a lot of the really interesting institutional features that are policy relevant today are around, right, some of these mandates are implemented at the city level, sometimes at the state level. I would like to know which ones work better. Some of these mandates include police chiefs, others don't. Let's figure out that role. And then, right, we have this big literature showing that politics still matters for police behavior today. There's a nice paper by Sashko on, for example, DA turnover and impacts on police use of force. Mayors might still matter, and their turnover might still matter. So I would like to see that figured out. And then last, these reforms often happen when training occurs. So, that's probably a different project, but just I would love to know how widespread that is. And since it's only 31 departments, I think it's worth talking about. The second area, promotion and hierarchy, right? So we have data on your rank. So I think that a natural place for this work to go is who gets promoted amongst existing officers, amongst new hires. When the reforms come in, are existing officers allowed to just kind of age out, or do they disappear at a younger age, in which we could presume they're dismissed? Do commonalities to the chief or to the mayor matter in terms of internal promotion? And then I think probably the biggest question is, right, if we have some sense as to where officers are coming from and where they live, right, this is an area where we're beginning to see officers leaving where they police, and that could be captured. So again, maybe another project, but maybe it happens within this paper. And so then just about out of time, last places that I would touch, again, there aren't a lot of cities, but I would still like to see just a rough, if the paper is going to take a more descriptive path, thinking about heterogeneity. And in particular, I would want to think about heterogeneity with respect to the history of police unionization in the department, the presence of a fraternal order, because you could imagine that there might be tensions there between those organizations and this policy shift. If the authors do lean into city level analysis, other outcomes that we could think about, this paper is about politics and policing. We can think about impacts of this reform on political violence. We have pretty nice data on executions by race locally, so you could think about impacts there. And there are a series of other paths that it could take. I think many would be valuable, but obviously you can't do all of them. Now, where can this go in my last 30 seconds? This time period is so important for trade unionism and policing. These data cover the first wave of police unions. It covers when those unions are broken and wiped out. So we can ask, what are the impacts of those unions? Who organizes? Who doesn't? And then actually at an individual level, we can figure out which officers survived the purges. And that's something that we don't usually get to see. So that would be very neat. And then two, many of the questions we care about in race and policing, we can think about in a different era with a different population in this paper, and I think that could be a really nice follow-up. So I'll leave things there, and thank you to the authors for a chance to look at this neat work.
Thank you, Rob. Are there any questions from the floor? We've got two or 3 minutes. Sean, why don't you come up here so that
So, Rowena, there's a real issue about endogeneity, right? So if you're thinking that this post-reform, you're going to exclude immigrants, how's that associated with waves of foreign-born in particular cities and other kinds of issues of that sort, which is, are you going to treat the passage of reform as exogenous or endogenous? Now, I understand at the individual level, it's exogenous, but at the population level, it can't be. Then the other thing is, years ago, a member of this association, Becky Menace, had worked on the progressive movement in a variety of ways. And if you want, I think I have all her non-published papers. She exited the profession, but she kept finding the same thing over and over again, that progressive reform had no effect on the provision of public services, because most of the passage of non-reform was for price. So you paved as many streets, you did all this stuff, you just charge a different price under corruption. So it would be really worthwhile. I'm not surprised that you're getting small results, but I'm much more concerned about you integrating the politics of passage of reform in what you're thinking about doing. Is there a crime wave before? It's like water diffusions, all these other kinds of things that cities did. They don't happen by chance. And then that may tell you a little bit more about who gets affected.
So thanks. Mainly, I want to say a big thanks to Rob for all of your comments. I think that was very helpful. And thanks to Jean-Laurent also. I think that's also why we want to look at episodes where it was the state implemented it and they said if you have a population about this amount, then you adopt this policy. Then we get to more exogenous cases, but we take that point certainly. Yeah, and thank you. Is it coffee time?
I think we're done.
Okay.
So I think we've hit 2:30. Thank you here and around the world. And with that, we'll adjourn.